everybody. This is Andy Steele of AE911Truth, and you are watching our brand new show called The Focus. And the whole point of this show is we're going to be zeroing in on specific topics within the issue of controlled demolition, of course, but things that people may not think about very often or of special consideration to the great engineers that make up our organization, architects and engineers for 911 Truth. So today we're going to be focusing in on a question that Roland Angle has been asking, and it's should NIST have been chosen to investigate the World Trade Center building failures to begin with? How many of us actually think about that? Why was NIST chosen to head up this important investigation? Why was this specific agency put in charge of something that was so important? And of course, we know what they came up with in the end. So what's going to happen is we're going to be bringing Roland on. He's going to be giving his presentation. And when he's finished with it, he's going to be getting challenged, questioned, discussed, his topic discussed with our great panel of engineers. I'm just going to briefly introduce them. First one is Kamal Obeid. Kamal serves on the AE911Truth board. He has been a practicing civil and structural engineer in the San Francisco Bay Area since 1980 and a licensed structural engineer since 1985. And he is a longtime member of the Structural Engineers Association of Northern California. He's going to be joined by Eugene Johnson. Gene is a board member here at AE911Truth as well, and he's also a PDD volunteer. He has a BSME and 30-plus years experience as a construction and mining engineer. And they'll also be joined by John Schuler, who is a civil engineer. He has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Lehigh University and a Master of Science of Civil Engineering from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. A lot of great credentials these guys bring. So I'm introducing them now just so I can remove them back to the peanut gallery. So guys, thank you for showing up for this moment. I'll be seeing more of you later. Now, our presenter today, as I mentioned, is Roland Angle, and he is the chairman of AE911Truth. He graduated from the University of California, Berkeley with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. He also served in the U.S. Army Special Forces, where he was trained in the use of explosives. He became a licensed civil engineer in California, and his 50 years of engineering experience has included designing and testing of blast-hardened missile launch facilities and designing U.S. naval explosive containers, harbor terminal facilities, earth foundation systems, and hydraulic systems. Roland has owned 3 construction companies and has taught engineering subjects to high school students. And, of course, he was founder of AE911Truth's Project Due Diligence, which is doing a great job getting various people, various engineers out to the grassroots of the profession talking about our important evidence. So, Roland, that is a big intro for you. I am going to disappear now. I will see you at the end of this show, but the floor is all of yours to present. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, Andy. The topic that we are going to discuss today is a very important question that, to my knowledge, hasn't been discussed much at all in the quest for answers that make sense regarding the collapse of the 3 towers at the World Trade Center on 9/11. That question has to do with the government agency that conducted the investigation for the government, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So the question that I'm asking is, should NIST have been chosen to investigate the building failures at the World Trade Center? We have historical perspective on this from earlier events, and I'm going to make some observations and some comparisons about how this investigation, or actually 2 investigations, the one that they published on the World Trade Center towers and the one that they published on Building 7. I'm going to be looking at comparing those reports and the process that went into bringing them into being compares with what has been done in the past, and if it makes sense legally and ethically for NIST to have conducted those investigations. Was it legal for them to conduct the investigation into the collapse of the 3 high-rise buildings at the World Trade Center? That's the first question that I want to look at. Going back, we now know that Congress reacted to intense public pressure and authorized an investigation into the building failures by passing Public Law 107-231 on October 1st, 2002. And that public law was titled the National Construction Safety Team Act, or NCST, as we'll probably refer to it here for short purposes. There are some sections of that Construction Safety Team Act that I want to look at in regards to the reports. There was a clause that addressed the question of conflict of interest. Now, of course, when you are conducting a forensic investigation into the collapse or the failure of a structure, you want to make sure that there's no conflict of interest in the manner of who is conducting the investigation. For instance, if you're examining the collapse of a dam, you would not want to hire as a consultant somebody that worked on the dam, somebody that was involved in the construction or the design of the dam, or the any of the relevant agencies that were involved in the construction of that dam. So you want to make sure that your people that are conducting the investigation don't have a conflict of interest. That's basic investigation procedure. Second clause that is of interest, there's actually 3 of them in the Act that are concerned with the preservation of evidence. So, of course, again, you want to make sure that all the evidence that you can collect that is relevant to the failure is preserved, so that you can study it, you can test it, you have it to refer to as the investigation moves forward. And the last clause that's of interest is preserving the evidence in a specific case. That is, if you believe that a criminal act was involved in the failure of the examination of the failure that you're carrying out. Because if there was a criminal act, then law enforcement agencies are going to be involved, and you're going to have to work with those law enforcement agencies in determining how, when, where, and all the aspects of actually preserving the evidence conform to their standards of how that evidence should be preserved. So the act that Congress passed, the National Construction Safety Team Act, had clauses in it that addressed each and every one of these concerns. So we're going to look at those for a minute. Section 2C1 of the Act says, quoting, "The NIST director shall develop procedures to include provisions regarding the conflicts of interest related to service on the team." So the Act specifically directs the director of NIST to make sure that there's no conflicts of interest that is involved with anybody on the team that has been put together. So they're saying, watch out for conflict of interest, investigate everybody's connection to the event and to the structure that is involved. Make sure that none of them have a conflict of interest. That was the specifically required of the director of NIST by the law. Was it a conflict of interest for NIST to conduct the investigation into the building failures? NIST is a branch of the Commerce Department, and Commerce is one of the part of the executive branch of the government. The executive branch of the U.S. government was responsible for providing the security of the United States on 9/11 through one of its other agencies, the Department of Defense. Therefore, Congress gave the executive branch of the U.S. government the authority to investigate itself, despite the fact that the executive branch was a party to the event. This is a breach of fundamental investigation procedures. So, right off the bat, we see that Congress handed over the investigation to the same branch of government that was involved in the event and potentially had some liability and potentially could have been at fault because the attacks occurred. The Department of Defense was responsible for protecting the U.S. that day. They failed to do so. So then the question is, well, why did they fail to do so? And we're going to have an investigation, try to get to the bottom of it. And if the Department of Defense was found to be at fault, then NIST was going to be under pressure not to have that finding because they were involved in the same department of the government that the Department of Defense was. This conflict of interest was apparent and subsequently reflected in the many legally required procedures that NIST ignored, along with biased and unscientific decisions made or controlled by NIST throughout the investigation into the building failures. So indeed, when we have come up with all the problems with the NIST reports, we can understand why those errors and inconsistencies and omissions could be there, because NIST would be subject to pressure from within its own organization and above, up the chain of command to the executive branch of government, for finding things that were embarrassing to the executive branch of the government. NIST hired subcontractors to produce certain sections of the NIST reports. NIST did not have the expertise to carry out all the investigations with their own personnel, so they hired contractors. Many of these subcontractors had prior relationships with NIST and other agencies of the federal government that should have disqualified them from being part of the investigative team per Section 2C1A of the NCST Act. So not only did they have a problem with their own conflict of interest, they then turned around and hired subcontractors, some of whom had conflicts of interest that should have disqualified them. In terms of preservation of the evidence requirements of the law, those were ignored as well. According to Section 2C1, the director is responsible, we're talking about the director of NIST, is responsible for guiding the teams in moving and preserving evidence by moving such records, components, materials, and artifacts related to the building, and to the maximum extent feasible, preserving evidence related to the building failure consistent with the ongoing needs of the investigation. So a couple of clauses in the law specifically stated that. Now, there's a problem here because this violation of the law may have little relevance to NIST because NIST didn't come on the scene until more than a year after the event. Because as we noted, the law itself wasn't passed until October 1st, 2002. By that time, most of the physical evidence had been removed and destroyed, and NIST had no control over that. That process had already occurred. Much, if not most, of the material had been recycled, shipped overseas. And so NIST, it was beyond NIST's control to be able to exercise control over that. It was the responsibility of the FBI, the New York City Police, and FEMA to preserve the evidence, and they failed to do that. So that's on them. There was some of the evidence that was left, and NIST was certainly responsible for everything that came into their possession as of October 1st on 2002. Then there's the question of preserving evidence at a crime scene. So a section of the law said, quote, if a federal law enforcement agency suspects and notifies the director that a building failure being investigated by a team under this act may have been caused by a criminal act, the team, in consultation with the federal law enforcement agency, shall take necessary actions to ensure that evidence of the criminal act is preserved. However, This clause has little relevance to NIST in this case, since most of the physical evidence, again, had been removed and destroyed before NIST took control of the investigation. Responsibility for destruction of the evidence should rest on the FBI, the New York City Police, and FEMA. However, I would like to note that, to my knowledge, the FBI never called it a crime scene. Instead, they referred to it as a terrorist act and somehow evaded the requirements of the law in terms of preservation of the evidence because of that ruling. That's the best of I can come to my understanding. I've never seen any explanation by the authorities, NIST or anyone else, to explain how and why they removed most of the evidence at a crime scene. So that's one of the questions that we just get stonewalled on. They don't want to talk about that because it's too embarrassing for them to bring that subject up and begin to have a discussion about it. So therefore, we can conclude that the director of NIST at the time that the NCST Act was passed, who happened to be Arden L. Bennett Jr. in October of 2002, should have come back to Congress and refused to conduct the investigation as required by the law that had just been passed, because the law said that he had to avoid a conflict of interest. And therefore, that conflict of interest came into being immediately because he was investigating another arm of the executive branch of government. And that conflict of interest, which he refused to acknowledge, became apparent and was reflected in the critical NIST decisions that were made during the investigations, leading to conclusions that were inconsistent with the evidence. So when we look at the origin of the investigation, the legal mechanism that brought them into being, we can see that the conflict of interest was inherent right from day one of the beginning. The passing of that law and the selection of NIST to conduct the investigation involved the conflict of interest right there. So now, for a historical perspective, we're going to compare the investigation into the collapse of the buildings with the investigations that took place after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Now, we all know that the Project for a New American Century actually referred to the Pearl Harbor attack and said that it would require an event similar to Pearl Harbor to be able to enact the provisions that the Project for a New American Century was proposing. So the two events have a great deal of similarity. They were both attacks on American soil. They both constituted a great loss of life, and they both were carried out by surreptitious means without a declaration of war. And therefore, the events have some historical symmetry. Immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack, Congress ordered the Roberts Commission report, which was presided over by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, with 4 military officers making up the board. The commission issued its report just 6 weeks after the attack, finding that the commanders of the Naval Fleet and the Army at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, were derelict in their duties. Both officers quickly resigned from the military. Note that the commission was presided over by a member of the judicial branch of the government. So Congress brought in the judicial branch to oversee what they considered to be, or they were trying to perform, as a impartial finding, at least a preliminary finding, as to what had happened that enabled the attack to be so successful. Next, a Naval Court of Inquiry, conducted by 3 admirals, was held and issued a ruling on October 19th, 1944, so you're talking about almost 3 years later, finding that the Chief of Naval Operations, Harold Stark, had failed to warn Admiral Kimmel that an attack was imminent. So this finding, again, by the military in this case, found that there was a problem with the command, and as a result, Admiral Stark was relieved of his command as Chief of Naval Operations, and he retired from the Navy shortly thereafter. So note that this investigation was controlled by the U.S. Navy. The next investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack was conducted by the Army and Navy and was released to the public by President Harry Truman at the close of the war on August 29th of 1945. The conclusion of that report was that the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall were largely responsible for the lack of preparedness at Pearl Harbor. So here we have another investigation, and some other suspects are brought into the arena. Note that this investigation was controlled by the Army and the Navy. Another investigation was then conducted by the Joint Committee on the Investigation of the Pearl Harbor Attack, which came to be known as the Pearl Harbor Committee. When the war ended, immediately thereafter, within days, Senate Majority Leader Alben Barkley called for the creation of a joint committee to explore the, quote, contradictions and inconsistencies, unquote, within the preceding reports. His resolution was unanimously approved that same day in the Senate, and 5 days later, the House concurred. The committee was formed and consisted of 5 senators and 5 members of the House of Representatives, with Democrats outnumbering the Republicans 6-4. Barkley, a Democrat, chaired the committee. The committee proceedings were acrimonious, with Republicans claiming that the Democrats were withholding evidence that implicated Franklin Delano Roosevelt in provoking the Japanese to attack as a means of getting popular support to enter the war. Now remember that FDR had just died earlier that year, in April of 45. So FDR was now passed away, and the committee was looking into inconsistencies in the earlier reports, which, as we can see, there were inconsistencies in terms of who was responsible and what was the problem. And they were immediately accused of engaging in partisan politics, and the fact that the Democrats outnumbered the Republicans on the committee was going to prove to be telling. The majority report, which was issued on June 20th, 1946, so we're now looking at some 9 months later, rejected the claim that FDR and his top advisors had, quote, tricked, provoked, incited, cajoled, or coerced Japan, unquote, into attacking the U.S. So you see that the committee directly confronted the issue of a potential false flag that FDR had pulled off and tricked the Japanese into attacking the base so that the U.S. could enter the war. Now, there was a minority report issued by 2 of the Republicans on that committee that stated that the majority report was, quote, illogical, and that, quote, it becomes apparent that the record is far from complete. So this report became the motivation for the passage of the National Security Act, which Truman signed into law on July 26, 1947, about a year later, which created the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency. So this is all very interesting, an interesting history that most of us, certainly myself, was not completely aware of. That the investigations into the failures of what occurred and allowed the Japanese attack to be successful wound up being the motivating factor for the creation of the national security state. The investigation into the cause of the Pearl Harbor attack led ultimately to the creation of the military and intelligence organizations that have dominated foreign and domestic political policies in the U.S. ever since. And we note that the Pearl Harbor Committee was created and controlled by the U.S. Congress. Comparing the government response to Pearl Harbor with the response to 9/11, we see that the response to Pearl Harbor was immediate, whereas the response to 9/11 was delayed by more than a year. Remember, it took a great deal of public pressure to get the president and Congress to admit that it was necessary to carry out an investigation at all. So in that year, most of the evidence was destroyed. A lot of the records and the people that were involved became a tangled field, much more difficult to investigate for NIST. So NIST was at a disadvantage because they weren't put in charge right in the first, but they were also at a disadvantage because they were involved in an inherent conflict of interest. Now, the response to Pearl Harbor was sustained and determined. There were a number of investigations carried out in the years since, in the few years after the event, and those investigations were looking to determine what really happened, and they came to different conclusions. Finally, at the end of the war, when FDR had passed away, the government moved to have Congress conduct a more complete investigation, and that investigation was actually removed any hint of guilt that FDR and the executive branch of government might have had in terms of creating a false flag to draw the U.S. into the war. In contrast, the response to 9/11 was a solitary event consisting just of the NCST Act and the Military Commission Act, which was not the 9/11 Commission, which was not enacted until several months after the Construction Team Act was passed. So there was not nearly the kind of determination to get to the bottom of what had happened. And in the time since the report was issued, the act was issued, and the NIST reports were issued, which now comes up on 13, 14 years, 18 years after the event, they still don't want to talk about it. So there's been no effort to go back and revisit the evidence that they examined at that time. On the one hand, Pearl Harbor was investigated by Congress, the military, and the judiciary in the various investigations, whereas 9/11 was investigated by Congress, the 9/11 Commission report, and by the executive branch of the government, as we've stated, NIST at the Department of Commerce. And whereas there were multiple investigations of Pearl Harbor, there were only two investigations of 9/11, the NIST investigations and the 9/11 Commission report. And I might note that the leaders of the 9/11 Commission report, several years afterwards, publicly stated in a letter to the New York Times that they had been denied evidence in their investigation, and they felt that the investigation was compromised. Lastly, the investigation of Pearl Harbor actually entertained the possibility that the executive branch of government had orchestrated the attack, whereas the 9/11 reports would not touch that evidence at all and did not even mention that possibility, and did everything that they could to prevent that discussion from even taking place. However, both investigations resulted in strengthening the military intelligence apparatus and domestic surveillance in the United States. So in both cases, the failure of the government to protect us resulted in strengthening the powers of the government. So, and loss of our civil rights and freedoms here in the US. So in that sense, both of the investigations had the same result. Now we're going to look a little bit at the history of NIST and how that's relevant to the reports on the building failures. NIST was created in 1988 by the outgoing Reagan administration, and it was created by consolidating various existing departments that already existed under the Department of Commerce, primarily the Department of Standards. The Department of Commerce is a cabinet-level department created in 1913 by President Taft, and it has a long history of intrigue and corruption. which we can go into at the discussion if we want to discuss further. But most recently, the Secretary of Commerce under President Clinton, Ron Brown, was shot in the head, and a dozen Commerce Department employees were killed in his plane that crashed in Croatia on April 3rd, 1996. The investigators who tried to investigate Brown's death and the crash were silenced. These events were known to NIST employees and serve as a warning not to oppose any message emanating from the NIST director. So that was only 5 years prior to 9/11. And anyone that works for NIST, I'm sure, is quite aware of that history. So the conclusion that I come to, and I think that any rational person would agree with, is that NIST had a conflict of interest and never should have been selected to perform the investigation into the collapse of the buildings at the World Trade Center. They actively led the cover-up of the true facts regarding the building failures, and they continue to provide leadership to the ongoing efforts to sustain the cover-up. The Commerce Department, of which NIST is a part, has a history of providing cover for unlawful and illegal high crimes committed by persons within the executive branch of the U.S. government. The actions of NIST have had a direct bearing on the increase of repressive governmental authority that has occurred in the U.S. since 9/11. So I think when we look at the NIST reports clearly and their history and compare them to past investigations of a similar nature, we can say that these conclusions are valid. Now, that's what I would argue, but I would like to hear questions and comments from people that may have other opinions or would like to know more about this conclusion that I've come to. So, Andy, I'm ready to go back to you.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Roland. And let's go ahead and bring everybody else back in here, one at a time. 1 second. Push a little button. There we go. So I got a lot of questions because it's almost like you introduced some new information into the entire picture for me. And I definitely want to get to some of the stuff you were talking about at the end. I'm going to ask everybody to chime in with your questions, but I guess I'll just get started with the overall question of, if it was your call, Roland, back when September 11th had just happened, in your view, instead of NIST, what group should have carried out this investigation?
I would envision that it should have taken something like what we see with the National National Transportation Safety Board. The National Safety Transportation Board was formed as an independent agency, not subject to the funding requirements that come down through the executive branch of government, precisely because of an incident that occurred in 1931. In 1931, there was an airplane crash that killed Newt Rockne, who was the beloved coach of the Notre Dame football team. And there was such an outrage over the fact that this plane had apparently had some faulty aspect to its construction that the public demanded an inquiry into Rockne's death. And it was originally carried out by the precursor of the Federal Aviation Society. And they, of course, were trying to cover their backsides because they were responsible for the construction of overseeing construction of the aircraft. And of course, the aircraft industry was still in its infancy in those days. And there were problems with the investigation and the public was not satisfied. So the end result of that was that after the organization had been transformed into the Federal Aviation Agency, they formed a separate agency called the National Transportation Safety Board that was not under the FAA, because they realized that the FAA could have something to do with catastrophic failures of airplanes. They didn't want the FAA to be investigating something that they may have been responsible for. or they may have played some part in. So they formed an independent agency. That's what should have been done with NIST. NIST is not an independent agency. The Congress could have demanded that an independent agency be formed outside and not subject to the executive branch of government control. And they then could have made sure that the people that sat on that board had no conflict of interest, were not involved in the construction, the design, or in any other manifestation of the construction of those buildings. And they could have made sure that, at least done a lot better job of making sure that they would get an impartial investigation. And that's what didn't happen. First of all, there was the delay, and the delay enabled the FBI and the police and FEMA to engage in actions that they never should have been allowed to engage in, which was the destruction of evidence. And then when NIST came on the scene, the NIST director should have read the law and said, well, we can't do this. We've got a conflict of interest right here. So that should have been what happened. Nobody did their job the way they should have. And Congress did not then reflect upon what it was doing and say, gosh, we're asking somebody that was involved in this to be the investigators. They should have known that. So everybody fell down on the job. Congress, the Department of Commerce, NIST, the FBI, the New York City Police, FEMA, they all played a part in this. But NIST played a major part because it was then involved in creating the narrative as to why these buildings fell down. And in so doing, they had to omit and falsify information and swear that it was reasonable and rational under the protocols that are established in the engineering community, and they weren't. So that's what I think should have been done.
You know, I think, and I've written this before, that NIST had the most important job in this entire investigation because they're in a position where they're not even getting lost in the mirror maze of geopolitics and which agency should have done this to prevent this particular aspect of it from happening. But they can actually get down there at the base level of one of the most important parts of this event and look at the hard science, what actually took place at these sites. They were in a position to give the most thorough report to the American people about any aspect of 9/11, to give us the most clear picture that we could get from this event. And of course, they failed miserably, hence why we need to exist. Now, we're still creating the format of the show as we go here. I certainly don't want our engineers to have to compete with each other to speak up and ask a question or get a word in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it off to one of them if they want to comment on the material or ask a question. It is up to them, but we'll start with Kamal.
Well, thank you, Roland. This has been quite enlightening. I was not aware of all these laws and the history, especially of Pearl Harbor. Very interesting. My experience, right after 9/11 happened, I had heard initially that FEMA started the investigation almost from the get-go. And it wasn't much of an investigation. I think it was just like basically arranging, collecting evidence, arranging a trip for engineers to actually go out and actually take a look at the site, at the destruction. And I volunteered to go at that time, and I was not accepted. I was not, I guess there was a selection committee of some sort that they essentially selected a few well-known engineers to go out there at the time. And then subsequently after that, at the engineering societies, they started postulating, coming up with theories before any investigation was done. And it was all these theories about, especially the Twin Towers. There wasn't much talk about Building 7 at that time because it was very obscure. But the Twin Towers, because of their very dramatic failure, it just seemed like it was an exciting topic for them to start talking about. Then they talked about trusses and, the sagging of trusses and how they pulled the connections and all this other stuff. But it was all kind of, these theories that didn't have any basis. But I guess my question is, and this is something I keep, that bothers me a lot, and it's something that I keep mentioning in discussions that I have with other people and with other professionals. The evidence was made to disappear. The evidence was, but I just want to get it from you, Roland. What is the timeline? How did that happen? What was the timeline of that, of the removal of all the debris? And there's always all these rumors about where the debris went. They went to China. They went to somewhere else. So, do you have any information on that you can share with us? Timeline and where did the debris go? And how much was left, if any, for structural engineers to examine?
Well, that's a very excellent question. The information that we've been able to uncover is that the decision to haul off the material began almost immediately. And it was apparently, according to the sources that I have been able to find out, it was made by the Department of Design and Construction of the New York City bureaucracy. The head of that department is the guy that I've seen attributed to making the decision that it was okay to immediately begin to haul off the debris. That is, at least once the search and rescue operation was over in terms of the towers. So that occurred within a couple of weeks. Building 7, they could haul off immediately because they said that the building was unoccupied at the time that it collapsed. So there was no problem beginning to haul that off immediately. Now, most of that steel was taken to the fresh kill yards, salvage yards out on the river, and they sorted it out, and some of it was examined by the team that the Structural Engineering Association of New York put together of volunteers to go out there and examine those structural members. And there was also a professor from Cal Berkeley, Professor Astani. I know you're familiar with him, and he had been given a grant by the National Science Foundation 10 days before the buildings came down. That is on September 1st, 2001, he was given a grant by the National Science Foundation to investigate progressive collapses. So it was very handy that he had this grant in hand. He had the money. So he hopped on the plane, he flew out to New York, and he was put in charge of a lot of the collection of the evidence. So he complained actually at a testimony before Congress a few months later that he couldn't stop the hauling off of the evidence, and he said that it was a problem. The only evidence that was saved in terms of the steel frame of the buildings was about 235, 250, something like that, pieces, less than 1 or 2% of the steel in the building. And that had been selected by these engineers out at the debris yard. So that was the total amount of structural steel that was saved by the investigative team. And that was before NIST even came on the scene. See, NIST didn't come on the scene until almost a year later. So that process was the responsibility of the law enforcement agencies to protect that evidence. And apparently there was nobody that challenged the city of New York official that allowed the removal of the evidence that had enough authority to stop it from happening. And even though complaints were made and people said, hey, this stuff is being taken away and we need to examine it, it seemed to be a steamroller that was rolling downhill, and nobody had the authority and was able to step in the way and stop it from happening. So that's the history as far as we know it. And it's very suspicious. It seems like, as with so many things that took place, decisions were made by unnamed, anonymous, or irrelevant bureaucrats, and nobody challenged them. Nobody stepped up and said, these are violations of the law. These are violations of investigative procedure. You're destroying evidence that is going to prevent us from really having a better look at what happened here. Didn't happen. So,
thank you,
did
Kamal.
that answer your question,
That
Kamal? Is it?
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Roland.
All right, and sorry if I interrupted. I heard Roland cut off in my ear, so I thought he was finished. But sorry about that. But let's move on to Gene. I want to give you a chance to chime in your thoughts. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask them.
Two questions, Roland. NIST was given the responsibility to determine the cause of the failure for those three buildings, and they issued two reports. The first report was in regard to the Twin Towers. The second report was the Building 7. To your knowledge, were those reports ever properly peer reviewed by today's standards? So that's question one. And question two, when we look at the collapse of those buildings, especially Building 7, it's obvious that controlled demolition was involved and explosives were involved. And that's been pretty much confirmed by the University of Alaska report, where they concluded that in order to duplicate the collapse of Building 7, it would have required a global failure. Now, in neither of those reports that NIST published do they mention the possibility of explosives. Do you think they were instructed not to talk about explosives? And who would have done that and why?
All right. Well, the first question, which involves, state your first question again.
Were those NIST reports properly peer reviewed by our standards today?
NIST claimed that they had hired people to conduct peer reviews of their reports. However, they've never revealed who those people were, and they've never revealed why they should be allowed to pay people to peer review their report, because obviously that's a conflict of standard practice. So the answer to that question is no. The NIST reports have never been peer reviewed properly, as they should have been, by anyone else in the profession. The second question is, in terms of who might have ordered them to not investigate the question of explosives. That's a big question, of course. That's a major question. And we have no way of knowing unless we can get somebody to come forward from within NIST to reveal the inner workings of those investigations and determine how that decision was made. They claim that the decision not to investigate explosives was made because they had examined the audio evidence of the building failures and they could never find any explosions that would have created the significant audio footprint that they would have needed. But that's a non-answer, because they're acting as if they're only looking at dynamite or RD4 to C4 to have conducted the explosives. And NIST was already at that time, they got a $161,000 grant from the government that year to investigate nanothermite. So NIST was well aware that nanothermite existed and the capabilities of nanothermite to be used as a cutting charge all the way up to a high explosives. And depending upon how you mix it, what you put in it, you can get any one of those scenarios. So NIST acted as if they were not aware of any such technology, where in fact they were already getting money to study and develop that technology. So clearly there was somebody. Let's just be clear. I don't accuse, and I don't think anybody on Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth is accusing people at NIST or people in the engineering community of being involved in planning the destruction of these buildings. That's not what we're doing. We're saying that they were pulled into the process of covering up that event, and whether they did that knowingly or unwittingly, that's to be determined, and you'd have to examine each person on an individual basis. But somehow there were people within that investigative team at NIST and some of their contractors that were incentivized to make decisions regarding the evidence that were not consistent with the scientific principles. So that's what we're saying. And we, at the same time that we have some compassion for those people for being put in that situation, and probably it couldn't have been a comfortable situation for them. And they were pulled into the wrong side of history, and forever they're going to be on that side. It's not good for them. And furthermore, they were accessories after the fact to a crime, whether wittingly or unwittingly. So the question of the criminals, somebody that planned this event and executed this event, let these people know exactly, in no uncertain terms, what their boundaries were. What were they going to come up with, and what were they not going to come up with? And undoubtedly, there must have been some communication back and forth between the actors in this case at NIST and the subcontractors and the perpetrators. There must have been. That cover-up was an ongoing, and still is an ongoing process. And somebody that was at NIST or their contractors had contact with the perpetrators. Had to have happened. They didn't get this stuff subliminally. So I think, the answer to your question is, we don't know that answer yet. We'd like to find out.
Thank you.
Right. It seems like they did everything they could just to avoid taking on the potential of it being controlled demolition. So I'd like our audience to write in with their thoughts about that too. Where did those orders to stay away from that come from specifically? John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Your thoughts about the presentation, or any questions you have for Roland?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Yes, Roland, it was excellent. I always learn a lot from your presentations. Always learn more and more about this whole fiasco of 9/11. You sort of touched on it, but when NIST was appointed to investigate this, is that an agency that even has the the firepower, the engineering expertise to investigate it? Was it really engineers or bureaucrats who did this report? For people who aren't familiar with it, is it a technical report, or who did do the report actually?
Well, that's a good question. Clearly, they did not have all the firepower that they needed, because they hired outside experts. They hired subcontractors to do critical aspects of the report, and we've got a list of those contractors and those consultants, and we've added them to our list of persons of interest, because we know that they conducted a lot of the actual work itself. NIST was, as I noted, was a relatively new agency. It had only been pulled together in 1988, and I think that's kind of a significant year, because that was the year that Reagan left office. Remember that Reagan's vice president was George H.W. Bush, and he then came to power and was president for 4 years. And he was I believe, the main impetus behind putting this together, because I think they realized at that point already from earlier disasters like Katrina that they needed the firepower, as you put it, of the engineering profession and the scientific community to conduct forensic investigations of this sort. So NIST was sort of cobbled together and given a new name. Various departments were put together. They created a new bureaucracy, and they had some engineers. There are many engineers at NIST. I'm sure many of them are quite competent, and I'm not casting aspersions on NIST. In fact, I've met many engineers that are surprised that NIST was involved in this, because they said that their experiences with NIST were quite, they consider them to be a highly professional organization. However, they were not set up to conduct a forensic investigation of this sort, and had never done so. So in that sense, this is their first rodeo.
I mean, is it a report that's actually stamped by a PE somewhere that, would be used as, say, expert testimony or anything like that?
It's interesting that they make the disclaimer in their reports that they cannot be used for testimony. There is no stamp. There's nobody who's responsible for this report. I suppose you could say that Shyam Sunder is responsible, since he was directed to conduct these investigations, but his stamp is not on those reports. There's nobody that's responsible, and they specifically disclaim any responsibility and note that none of the conclusions or none of these reports can be brought into a court of law, for instance, in a lawsuit. So they're saying this is an official report, but it has no weight. Interesting.
Yeah.
Good question.
All right, folks. So that is the first episode of The Focus. This is a work in progress. We're still figuring out the format as we go along. If you have suggestions, ideas on how we can improve it, please send a polite letter to us at AE911Truth.org. You'll see there's a contact box right there on our page. Let us know what you think. How can we improve the show, make it even better than what you've seen tonight, which was pretty good in my opinion. So for AE911 Truth, this is Andy Steele saying we'll see you next month with a brand new presentation here on The Focus. Good night, folks.